Welcome everyone to the Nova Scotia Nature Trust's first session in our Connecting with Nature webinar series. We look forward to a time when we can once again gather together in person for our events, but we are very pleased to be able to offer these virtual versions, and we want to thank you all for joining us today. This webinar series is made possible by a partnership with our generous friends at the East Coast Credit Union. A great big thank you to them for their support during these uncertain times. Today's webinar is about ecological landscaping. My name is Christina Nunn, and I am the Office Coordinator at the Nova Scotia Nature Trust. Joining me today is our special guest, Rosemary Loans from Helping Nature Heal. Together, we are going to share the story of Nature's House and hope to provide you with some inspiration and information for your own ecological landscaping projects. We will have time after the presentation to answer your questions via the Q&A function on your screen. And we may not get to everyone today, but we will make every effort to follow up with you after the event if we don't get to your question. We are also recording the session to allow for viewing at a later time. Rosemary Loans is an ecological landscape designer, speaker, consultant, and educator. She is one of North America's leading experts in protecting priceless coastal properties from erosion, and she is the founder and CEO of Helping Nature Heal, an award-winning landscape design company that has been recognized globally for its work in preventing shoreline erosion and preserving coastal ecosystems. Rosemary pioneered the shoreline erosion management system, which has helped dozens of homeowners protect their properties from coastal erosion. Her work has been featured in dozens of media outlets across North America. Rosemary has a BA in Conservation and Environmental Studies from York University, with prior studies in architectural design and further training in horticulture as therapy, ecological landscape design, shoreline erosion, master gardener, and landscape management. As a much sought after speaker, Rosemary has addressed the International Restoring American Estuaries Conference in Washington, D.C. on the topic of living shorelines, as well as walrus talks in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and has been honored to speak at many other conferences and events throughout North America. The Nova Scotia Nature Trust was formed in 1994 by a group of Nova Scotians who foresaw the wisdom of conserving the province's increasingly threatened natural legacy. The Nature Trust is a charitable organization that focuses on protecting our most unique and significant natural areas through land conservation, stewardship, and education. Over the past 26 years, we have protected over 15,000 acres of land, from coastal islands to old-growth forests. We are working to create a truly lasting legacy and protect our wild spaces and species so generations to come will be able to experience the joy and sense of wonder that nature provides. We carry out many campaigns and projects to identify and protect places of unique environmental value. We work with landowners and other partners to protect significant natural areas on private land throughout Nova Scotia, primarily through acquisition and conservation easements. We also have an active volunteer program, engaging citizens all across the province, helping to care for our network of over 120 conservation sites. While our conservation work takes place throughout Nova Scotia, we are based out of our office in Dartmouth. We purchased this property in 2016 in order to provide organizational stability and significantly decrease our annual operating costs. Our new home also provides an opportunity to reduce our environmental footprint and bring our biodiversity conservation mission into the city. However, like many older houses, the property posed challenges. So we have been working to convert those problems to benefits by creating Nature's House, a model of sustainable, environmentally friendly, green urban design where we showcase native biodiversity as well as water and energy conservation with simple, affordable solutions that others can easily replicate. When we acquired the 100-year-old house, it was on a typical urban lot. There were a number of areas of concern that we wanted to work on to improve the environmental impacts of the property. The non-permeable surfaces and limited drainage on the site contributed to significant stormwater runoff during rainfall events. We wanted to reduce our impact on the municipal stormwater system by installing on-site stormwater management solutions. The backyard consisted of a lawn and ornamental garden. There were few native species, and the lawn required significant maintenance. We wanted to create an oasis of biodiversity through design and indigenous plantings that would attract wildlife and pollinators while reducing the amount of watering and energy required. All of this work created a case study of opportunities, practical actions, and benefits that we can now share with other community groups and homeowners who may want to implement similar measures. Helping Nature Heal has helped us to address these issues, and Rosemarie will now tell you about their role in our journey. Over to you, Rosemarie. You want to unmute?
Thank you, Christina. That's wonderful. You know, it's such a pleasure for us at Helping Nature Heal to work with organizations like Nova Scotia Nature Trust in achieving their really wonderful, powerful goals, and especially in demonstrating to the community that these measures can be done in a small space, and they can be done, you know, by hand with concerted effort, of course, with volunteers and some skilled people. Anything is possible. So I just wanted to really express my gratitude and thanks to you and the organization for engaging with us and trusting in us to build this beautiful, diverse ecosystem for you and bring back nature right in the heart of Dartmouth. So thank you for that, and we'll get started. Let me tell you a little bit about Helping Nature Heal, and you can go ahead and flick that slide too if you like. Our mantra is restoring the earth and restoring the soul. Our deep connection to nature is really profound. As a company, I don't know, you know, how we would manifest these goals of ours, of our company and of our clients, if we didn't have a real depth of engagement. And so I wanted to just share with you some of the awards and memberships that we have so that you know, understand where that depth comes from, how that shows up for us here at Helping Nature Heal. So of course, we've had a wonderful long-term relationship with the Nova Scotia Nature Trust, with other organizations like the Ecology Action Centre in Halifax, with Coastal Zone Canada, who is also, you know, throughout the entire nation concerned about our riparian and coastal zones. Of course, we belong to landscape design organizations and Landscape Nova Scotia. We've won some awards through twice being nominated by the Canadian Museum of Nature for our work at the community level, you know, organizing community gardens, native pollinator gardens throughout communities and towns, at schools. And we've been featured several times on CBC radio throughout the Maritimes to just really help progress the movement into nature and allow people to really see that there are other people doing this work, and to inspire them and give them skill and knowledge to be very successful in their own transition from urban, perhaps heavily mowed landscapes to something that is much more sustainable and green. So we can go ahead and flip that screen as well. And we're going to start this talk by speaking about the biodiversity. So we'll see that this backyard is what we walked into, and it wasn't very diverse, right? There's lots of grass there, pretty monoculture, although it was quite weedy. There was some a little bit of diversity with the intruders, the invasives in that lawn. lots of ornamental shrubs and perennials. And, that's great for a typical, family perhaps that needs some play spaces or needs to throw a frisbee for the dog or whatnot. Fortunately, there's beautiful park right across the street for those kinds of activities. So I was really quite excited to see this blank slate, so to speak, and to be able to start working on proposing design ideas for them. So we'll flick that screen as well, Christina. Here is one of the concept drawings that was done early on to kind of navigate and see how we would actually use the space if it didn't have a lawn covering the backyard. So this is facing from the porch, looking out through the backyard towards the patio area. And, this is all mowed right now with just a perennial border with some trees and shrubs on the outside. So of course we wanted to take that over, add in some rocks and stumps and lots of vegetation. We high grade our list to native species for this project especially. However, oftentimes we'll also include things that we call heritage species that would have come with our earliest immigrants to Canada. So we respect those as being here for a long time, and that, they give us some great visual pleasure, lots of pretty flowers and things from a wide variety of heritage species, things like forsythia and rhododendrons, perhaps. People love having that early spring color. And so it's nice to incorporate some of those. If we go to the next slide, we'll see us in progress here. So we decided that we would do a sod conversion, or also known as lasagna gardening to some. That might be the way that the term is used. We do this, in fact, for time saving, but also to save on our human energy of having to reverse that lawn. So a lot of people think that you have to actually dig it out and remove those sods and then start replenishing the soil horizon, when in fact, using this lasagna garden or sod conversion opportunity is much simpler. It's a lot easier on your back. You don't have to be digging and pickaxing away all these sods and removing them. We can actually use them to our benefit. When we put cardboard on top of grass, there's the decomposition process begins. And so without light, without a lot of oxygen on those green leafy portions of the plant begins to decay and decompose. And in that process, we're actually feeding the soil food web critters and all the biology that lives below our feet. And so we are giving opportunity for those activities, for those critters, to move up into the soil horizon, to the surface, and really start digesting that paper and gathering nutrients and grit and sediment out of the soils that we place on top of the newspaper. So lasagna gardening is something that you can check into. There's different methods that can be employed. We like to use 2 or 3 layers of cardboard in the spaces that will become gardens, and the other zones will become trails and other aspects. And we'll see those design details as we click through. So we also collect the cardboard from local businesses, which we're trying to, relieve some of the weight and the pressure on our municipal systems. So if we can be more self-sufficient with our debris from packing and packaging and use it in the landscape itself, then we're winners on both angles, right? We're removing things from getting into the municipal systems of waste removal and garbage, and we're using it to decompose this lawn and become a healthier foundation for the soils and the gardens that we'll plant above them. So we'll click to the next slide. And so here we see just more of that cardboard work, and we usually put 8 to 12 inches of soil on top of the cardboard if we're trying to kill off a really a fine quality lawn that has a lot of root mass and is really robust. We can do different layer levels, different thicknesses of layers based on what type of plants we're going to be using. If we're putting trees into locations, then we want to have a thicker soil horizon and have more stability, more nutrients put into that soil horizon at the onset. If we're planting perennials, then it's a different amount. So I would encourage people to think about, you know, the landscape, instead of it being completely horizontal and flat like a lawn typically is, of getting some more character and some more interest in the landscape by making it more topographically interesting, if that makes sense, so that there's mounds and valleys and spaces to walk that are level, but that the gardens themselves have a very different texture. Maybe they are, you know, undulating in several directions, kind of like waves, and that they have the depth that the plants need at planting time. Of course, we know the plants will dig into that virgin soil below eventually, but we need to really feed them well while they're sitting on top of this cardboard in the beginning stages of this lasagna gardening. You can see on the left-hand side of this slide, we have different size pots. There's different types of plants there. Some of those were volunteers and donations from the previous fall. And so, you know, there's a great variety and selection of plants in this garden now. So if we flick to the next slide, we'll see some more pictures about this. This very interesting. So you can see that we're really triangulating, focusing the pathways on the back wall of this space. And that patio area this summer, hopefully, and into the future will become a real gathering place for people to enjoy the landscape, to have social time, but also for the Nature Trust folks to potentially have meetings outside, get some fresh air while they're working in the city in that tight building. So these raised beds that you see now, these mounds of soil, are framed by the green grass. Those become pathways in the next few slides. You can also see on the left-hand side of this slide that the gardens have been cleaned. There's been some pruning done. The shrubberies that were too big to move were just pruned. And then perennials and ground covers and really plants that really sort of don't belong in a native display have been taken out. We've traded those with other people for native species, and we're really trying to, at this stage, make it as native as possible. So another feature I just wanted to point out on this slide is at the back wall, we have that white concrete wall. There's a sort of a small border garden at the base and then a rock wall in front of it. That gives us about 2 feet of plantable zone at the back there. And so in the future, you'll see that we've got some small plants and trees in there. I just wanted to point that out, since everything is pointing to the center of that patio, that wall becomes a feature. And one of the projects that we're looking forward to in the future is potentially having a mural painted on there, possibly of the animal life that should be or could have been present in downtown Dartmouth. So we're looking to all avenues of nature to be displayed in this location. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and here it is in the fall. You can see the leaves have fallen down from some of the trees in the canopy. The wood chip trail is in place. You still see that bed. It doesn't seem as raised now as it did before, and that's because the boundary or the framing of the wood chips, we have about 4 to 6 inches of wood chips now on top of that old lawn. And I should note, before we put the wood chips in place, we did put cardboard layers underneath that as well. And that helps prevent the, you know, some of the weeds and the pesky plants from popping up through those trails. It's not forever. There will be some weeding to be done here from time to time in this garden and in those trails, but this really tempers it for the meantime and allows us to get to a stable place with all the plantings before we have to start worrying about maintenance. So this is a beautiful picture with a little bit of color here and there. And I hope everyone can see that, you know, we've tried to be as diverse as possible. There's even an old rotten stump up over there that eventually gets laid down, and we grow some plants around that as well. So this, this sort of mid-construction photo is a good demonstration of how things are going to be looking in the future. We'll flick to the next slide. And here we are in the front yard. So the backyard was pretty simple. It was just a big rectangle that we got to play in. And this front yard really has some wonderful engineering going on within it. Right in the center of this photo is a large boulder, a large piece of granite. And just behind that, you see the ramp that comes down. It's sort of a boardwalk through nature. Underneath the boardwalk is a bit of a drainage system, and we'll talk about that more in the stormwater management segment, but I just wanted to point it out here so that you see the beginning portions of it. This is a photo of early days when the intruders, the weeds, so to speak, have come back in after the beginning of the construction the previous fall. So they had the stormwater management system put in place, some soils put in, some rocks put down, and then, you know, winter happened. So when we arrived in the spring, the intruders, the invasives had started to show up. So we've had to clean that zone up and then start adding the soils and whatnot. So this is sort of pretty raw and pretty fresh in the process. You can see there's also on the right-hand side of the slide, you see some black gray gravel there. That is actually what we would call a dry well, or a space where water can be trapped and then slowly released through the horizon of the ground. And we'll talk about that in the stormwater management again. So let's go to the next slide and see how this is going to look. So here's some of the design concepts for both sides of that boardwalk, that sloped ramp. We have on the top left, the front left view, and, you know, looking for some roses, some dogwoods, maybe some perennials. I think there's, in reality, I think there's some milkweed in there as well that was planted by some of the earlier staff and I think volunteers to the Nature Trust. And then on the bottom, it's the front right view, so the opposite side of that ramp. You can see it sort of in the background there, and we've got things like ferns and grasses and small shrubs and some small trees and things as well. So these are sort of the concept ideas that we were toying with at the beginning stages. And then we'll hit the next slide, Christina, and we can see how things have come together. So we've got lots of pots of plants, of course, getting collected. We had plenty of plants donated by some of the volunteers and the allies of the Nova Scotia Nature Trust. And there's always room for a few more. So if anyone's poking around in their own backyard and are interested in donating some plants, we can always make room for more plants, of course. On the right side of the slide, we have some of our staff members, and they're just manipulating some of those larger boulders. We used our physics from high school with pivot points and poles and levers to make some of that work happen. We had some fun and some challenge with getting those strategically placed. And in the end, of course, it all works out. So you can see the plants in the front here. We have some hemlock, some maples, There's some dogwood in there and some various little trees and shrubs that will get installed into this location right away. So we'll flick to the next slide and see how things look once they're put around. So to the right of your screen, you can see we have some coarse woody debris, some rocks, of course, and then native plant species. There's ferns and bayberry and some small trees, collections of little trees as well. And the coarse woody debris is really important. It's really fun to see it from this angle as well. Yeah, so in that, the top right-hand slide, you can see the trail of pea gravel that's coming underneath the boardwalk. And of course, that's where our sort of faux creek is, where we have an entrapment well. That dry well is just at the point of that coarse woody debris. So it helps us to remember where it lives exactly. And the value of having that wood in the installation is really keen. And I'll just point out that on that top right-hand slide, to the left of the garden planting, you can see there's a log that's been embedded into the ground there. It also shows up in the bottom corner of the left side of this slide. You can see there's a log in there. These bits of coarse woody debris are super valuable. There's a book by Jamie Simpson called Restoring the Acadian Forest, and in that book he talks about how dead wood and dead trees, especially those that are allowed to stay vertical in the landscape, actually possess more living material. They're more alive than a standing live tree. And that seems incredible, right? That there's more biology, there's more stuff going on in these dead bits of wood than there are in those live trees. And so we really want to bring that point home and educate people on that when you have an old stump, you know, an old tree that had to be taken down, or an old chunk of driftwood or a piece of wood that you've hauled out from the woodland, it has a great capacity to benefit and harbor our nature inside of our landscape. So, you know, where this is an urban setting, we have smaller bits of wood and we have them more frequently tucked into the land. As that coarse woody debris breaks down, the actual breaking down process has a whole lot of biology connected to it. There's all kinds of fungi working on that chunk of wood, and bacterias and molds, and those are all our beginning decomposers. You know, that microbiology that sometimes we can't even see is at work for us, you know, to provide us with some abundance. There's this idea called the poop loop, and everyone always giggles at that, and I think it's really silly and fun, and it's great for us to remember how valuable and important it is. So the poop loop begins with decomposing wood fiber. You know, the biology in the soil that's locked in that soil horizon moves up, finds these bits of coarse wood and barks and leftovers from mulching and things, and they start to eat it up, right? The biology in the soil food web is doing that work. It's eating up these bits of wood. And then, of course, like all living creatures, they poop it out at the other end, right? And it's really this poop that is taking the minerals and all of the fibrous parts of the wood and exchanging it into a plant ready or a plant available component. The plants can actually absorb that nutrients and minerals through the poop loop. You know, if we just had a chunk of wood sitting beside a tree, you know, the tree can't actually feed on that piece of wood yet until it's digested by some other critter, right? So this soil food web, all of these critters that are locked underneath the soil are really doing great work for us. Of course, there's bigger critters than just fungi and biology and bacteria. There's ants and beetles and, you know, all the birds that eat those beetles and ants and snakes and amphibians and the whole gamut, the whole structure of the ecosystem really comes back to life once we start putting coarse woody debris back into the soil horizon and back into nature. So I'd really encourage you to see that stump or that chunk of wood as a piece of art. This is Mother Nature's art for us to make use of and to beautify these landscapes with. And in the end, really help replenish the nutrient cycling throughout this you know, what was a really urban, sterile landscape now has all this abundance to it. And that's really part and parcel because of the coarse woody debris that we put in place. So it doesn't have to show up as big chunks of wood. It can be borders that we use, log borders. It can be thick mulches. It can be leaves that we don't rake up too quickly, that we let leave in the garden for a while. And then of course, we have to talk about the rocks. Being in Nova Scotia, some gardeners say that we're actually just growing rock, right? The more you dig, the more you clean your surfaces, clean out your beds, the more rocks show up. And that's because of the frost cycle, you know, and the way that our parent material below us is chipping off and weathering and breaking due to all kinds of movement deep in the earth. Rocks find their way being pushed up to the surface. So it's nice to have rocks of multiple different sizes in your landscapes, and they provide some really great benefit too. So firstly, the large rocks absorb heat from the summer sun and then release it back out in the evenings. And especially in the winter time, we can see this a lot where the rocks are, you know, absorbing that February sun, which is really quite intense here in Nova Scotia. And then throughout the day, sort of melting snow that's wrapped right around that rock, and you can start to see the soil horizon again. You can see the layers of mulches and the plants become evident again. So this heat is being transferred out into the garden, out into the environment from those rocks. They're also weathering as the rain drops on them. You know, small amounts of grit and sediment are being displaced from that big heavy rock that we think never decomposes, never changes, and never goes away. Well, they do, right? And through the process of weathering, you know, we get to see that actually happen. So the rocks are providing minerals to the landscape. So that's excellent. The smaller rocks that we have provide space for air entrapment. They provide areas for bugs and beetles and things to kind of hide from predators. They also provide space for water to filter through and to drain. And so they provide, you know, a lot of really great benefits to our landscape. So I'm really encouraging you to have different size rock in your landscape. Some can be, you know, big enough to sit on, and some small enough that you can walk on. Those tiny pea gravels that are really reminiscent of beaches and sands and things. So we'll flip to the next slide and see what we've got going on here. This is sort of the final look of the garden. This would have been later in the fall. We can see some of the leaves have dropped off the trees. What a beautiful entryway, so much more interesting than that old pavement parking area. So we have plants in all the different zones. We have trees, shrubs, perennials, and ground covers. And then we also have made account for the soil food web critters as well. So all layers of the ecosystem are being attended to, or at least representative of. Of course, we can't have too many trees, like a real nature space. This is a sort of a display of naturalistic planting. If this was a forest, you know, you wouldn't be able to see through it. You would have to prune your way down through there. And since this is just early in the stages of its growth, everything is pretty tiny. And we've had lots of questions about this, about the design layout and the placements of the plants. And I wanted to just take mention that there's a pine tree, for instance, right underneath that window on the left-hand side of the slide. Now, we wouldn't normally plant a tree that close to a property, to a home, especially in an old stone foundation like these houses are typically at this age, because those root systems are going to be looking for food and water, and they're going to be, trying to find their way deeper into that soil horizon. The reason we planted these trees in the locations we did was to be able to have that conversation with people about how to plant, where to plant, and which plants are proper in certain zones within your landscape. So it stimulates a bit of conversation. It also allows us to do some workshops around how do we transplant plants out of a landscape? How do we work with native species? How do we actually dig in the soil around our properties without damaging the ecosystem that we've just created, and extract plants out of the landscape? And then what do you do once you take it out? What do you replace it with? So a lot of this landscape has been planned and designed on purpose to raise questions and to stimulate conversation and webinars and workshops that hopefully we'll be able to do with you later on in the season. Hopefully, with our COVID restrictions and things, eventually those will be lifted and we can actually do some hands-on workshops here. And the folks at the Nature Trust will be wonderfully creative, I'm sure, at figuring out how we're going to move forward with workshops and things during these pandemic times. So we'll see how that shows up in the future. But for now, we're just going to talk about it and have this great look at it. Another thing I wanted to show was that we have a cattail in this landscape, and that also is not frequently used in people's landscapes, and you'll see that repeated throughout here. And that's because of the water issues that we have on this property, and we wanted to really make this look like it's a little creek running through this property, and having a little standing water in a pool, and then having water movement through the riffles. So we wanted to try and mimic those things as best as we could within this land. So as this matures and grows, we'll be able to see those design features a bit more clearly where they're so tiny right now. We'll also be able to have lots of questions and lots of answers and lots of opportunity to engage folks in this landscape right here in downtown Dartmouth by digging and getting their hands dirty and really building a relationship with nature. Even though it's, a small space of it, we can still build those relationships. And I think that's wonderful that they've, given us this opportunity to have nature on both sides of this boardwalk and really have it feel like you're walking through a bit of nature right in the city. All right, we'll flick to the next slide and see. All right, stormwater management, perfect. This is a really exciting opportunity for us to work on the stormwater situation. So let's just have a look at the left-hand side here of our screen. We have patio slab walkway coming down through the two properties. The neighbor being the owner of the concrete wall with the heavy chain. So we have this very narrow space, and we can see there's eaves trough there with a water diversion pipe going underneath the deck. And then, bricks and plants and all kinds of things on the left-hand side of that patio slab pathway. On the right-hand side, we see there's some plants from the neighbor kind of reaching over top of the fence line. There's some weeds in there, a little bit of lawn, and it's a really kind of sad little place. It was mostly shade, a little bit of early morning sun, a little bit of evening sun gets in here. And we can see that it's kind of compacted. It has all the intruders in there, those small plants that really like those kind of wet, dark, dank places. And we really wanted to revive this space and make it useful and beautiful as people, entered the backyard of this urban setting. Some of the challenges that are happening here is that the eaves trough, going into that downspout, into that gutters, the eave of the house is quite narrow. And that's really something I noticed when I moved to Nova Scotia, is that the eaves are really small compared to those in other provinces. And so the rain rolls off the roof into the eaves trough and hopefully down that downspout. However, with climate change, we have a lot more aggressive storms now. We have, weird weather patterns that we hadn't seen in the past. We have more hurricanes succinctly with higher frequency throughout our storm season. And so those narrow eaves, just aren't fulfilling all of the needs of keeping the water under control, especially in a very compacted urban setting where there isn't a whole lot of natural absorption in the area. So to the left of the pathway, we really had to think about how is the water falling off the roof and entering the soil? Is it entering the basement and causing flooding in the basement, which I believe it was. And then on the right-hand side of that pathway, we can see that concrete wall is tipped out a little bit. That tells us that there's some freeze-thaw movement with water held in the soil horizon on the neighbor's property, pushing that concrete wall out. And of course, then she has a whole lot of plants there. So we really needed to attend to water on both sides of that path and try to make that more absorbent and responsive to all the water. On the right-hand side of this slide, we see the wooden staircase coming from the second floor. And again, beyond the fence line, we see it's a parking lot in the backyard. And so the water is, spilling off of that parking lot and then washing down the laneway. We'll move to the next slide and have a look at the design plan. So here we talk about what are we actually going to do about this water. So here are in purple, the water retention zone is below grade, and this is where we saw the pea gravel on top of the land, sort of demonstrating or making it look like a little faux creek. So the eaves trough water from both corners of the house is down through that purple zone, and then it lands in that dry well or that retention zone. And then the yellow line on the top of the design is the wood chip trail system. And we have water, of course, that we want to get away from the house and into a drainage zone. And then you can see in the light blue, we have 3 main water gardens or rain gardens. Really beautiful design details here and technique to install that. Was super fun and a lot of technical details, but again with appropriate structure and infrastructure below grade, not really a major issue. So now the water falls off the house, runs with a 2% grade towards the drainage that we put in place. Underneath that blue line, we have a rubberized trench that's filled with different size pebbles and rock to slow down the movement of the water. And then we put a thin layer of protective layer and then soils. So then we planted plants that really like to have what we call wet feet. Those plants love having water pushing through their system. And so those plants are strategically placed along those blue lines. And you can see just above the Helping Nature Heal logo, there's a small blue strip there again, and that's underneath that stairwell, the wooden stairwell that we were just looking at in the previous slide. So there's going to be a rain barrel system there, and some of the water from the neighbor is captured in that zone and allowed to drain more easily into the landscape and actually water and feed the plants that are contained in that unit. Okay, let's hit the next slide, and there's a view of the rain barrel underneath that stairwell garden with all of the, plants that are there, that are now there, that have been planted, ferns and shrubs and perennials and things. So that looks really cute and pretty and purposeful. And once we get our rain barrel system all connected this summer, it'll be even more purposeful. We'll be able to use that water to feed and water our plants throughout the landscape. Okay, we'll get to the next slide. So here is the design of what we called the forest trail, and that was the replacement of the patio slabs into a wood chip trail. You can see there's some cattails there and some beautiful blooming plants and shrubberies. And we'll hit the next slide. I think we get to see the process again. So, okay, so here we are on the top left-hand corner. We can see the different size pea gravels. You can notice some of the rubber sticking out before it was trimmed right there by the eaves trough, and how we graded everything to head towards the left, towards the neighbors, and then into a rubber trench with appropriate plants put in place. The bottom left-hand side of that slide shows the native species that we were putting into the parking zone to soften that, so that any of the water spilling off of that interlocking path would then filter into the native species and feed those plants. And on the right-hand side of the slide, again, you see that wooden stairwell with the soils being placed on top of the drainage, so that we can put the appropriate plants in there. And there's Chloe just spreading that soil on top of the cardboard. So we can hit the next slide. Okay, here's what I was thinking. So on the left-hand side, you can see the pea gravel at the base of the concrete wall, as well as the rubber liner. You can just see part of it right up against the concrete wall there. And that is basically a nice trough where all the water floods underground into that trough, and then is brought into the backyard, into the garden, where on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see people are planting the species in there. That's underneath that wooden stairwell again. So if we go back to the right-hand side, or the left-hand side of the screen, we can see we have some alders, some carex, the native water grasses. We've since planted in marsh marigolds and dogwoods and things like that, so that all the appropriate species that like to have wet feet are actually living in that zone. All right, we'll go to the next slide and see what it looks like at the end. Here we go. So the wood chip trail from the front of the house, from the street side through the backyard, and you can see all the various little beds that we've planted on top of our drainage technical structural work. And you can see there again, ferns and marsh marigolds, small trees, red osier dogwoods, some coarse woody debris. We've even got a seating area there with a stump turned into a mushroom. Looks kind of cute. And yeah, and that's a really much more welcoming entrance to the backyard than the patio slabs and all those invasive weeds and things. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see the rain gardens themselves. So there's a spillway there of pea gravel. That's where our rain barrel will sit. Underneath that is a nice big hole filled with miscellaneous rocks and things. We have a thin layer of geotextile on top, and then the soil, so that the plants are living on top of that drainage, on top of that structural components, and they'll just thrive there with all the water that they need. All right, we'll head to the next slide. Great. And this is looking on the front yard side. There's that pea gravel that we talked about, that sort of faux creek look. On the right-hand side of the slide here, you can see we've got some coarse woody debris, some red osier dogwood, some beautiful little birches, some iris, some grasses and things, and really just a really pretty little scene that will grow for years to come, and of course be a great space for us to do some workshops in. There's that tiny little white pine at the corner of the building, and that'll be the star of one of our workshops on how to move plants away from your house. That's great. I remember when we planted these gardens, and some of the staff and some of the passerbys were saying, oh my goodness, you're putting trees way too close. And it was like, yeah, that's on purpose. We're going to do that so we can have another workshop someday. All right, let's hit the next slide and talk about energy savings. All right, so the biggest energy savings we have here, of course, is the lack of mowing, right? If we're not spending that time, our personal energy, wasted mowing that lawn back and forth all day Saturday on our weekends and things, now this landscape is really just for enjoyment. It has a great purpose to identify some of our native species. There's some edible plants in there, all kinds of great things. And in the background of this photo, you can see we've planted some maple trees. There's some evergreens in there as well. Those will grow up and eventually create shade over this space, so that in that heat of the midday sun, we'll have a nice shade canopy there, and that'll help the people inside nature's house to not have to turn on the air conditioning so often, and really be able to have nature as the air conditioning. And so air conditioning savings in the summer, heat savings in the winter, of course, if you allow the winter sun to penetrate those windows and get into the house. That passive solar gain is really important in cost savings around energy use. And then, of course, not having to mow is a big one for sure. Saves on fossil fuels, all of those carbon dollars that we're spending. If we flick to the next slide, Christina, I think we can have another good look at that. So, you know, it probably took an hour or so to mow this backyard in its original state, when it was all lawn. And in the front yard, of course, it was all pavement. And so now neither of those spaces need mowing. And as our final slide here, I just wanted to say that eliminating mowing is one of the easiest things you can do, even if it's just a small amount. You know, if you just make those mowed spaces a little bit smaller, add some native plants to the edges, let nature grow in a little bit around you, and really embrace it with all of its diversity and all of its wonderful companions, then you certainly will have a much healthier landscape. You'll have a much healthier relationship with that space, and it'll be a great pleasure for you to hang out in there and be with your family and friends right in nature, even in downtown Dartmouth. I just want to say thank you to Christina for having me here today on this webinar. And of course, if anyone has questions, we have a few moments for that. And beyond that, please visit our website. You can contact us there, or stop by our office in Bridgewater, and we'll be happy to talk all things nature with you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. It was an amazing webinar. You did a great presentation. I'd heard some of that before, but put together like that, it was really, really wonderful. I hope that all of our participants were able to gather some really great information for their own projects. I also want to say thank you to your staff on site. They were absolutely amazing to work with, a wonderful crew, really, really great company. So if any of you are needing to get some work done like this, then Rosemary and her staff will help you absolutely. They're fantastic. I also want to say thank you to our many amazing volunteers. We had volunteers that helped with some of the heavy lifting, if you will, during the project too, and also some of the donations of plants and things like that were handled by our volunteers and supporters. So thank you all so much for helping to create such an amazing landscape around Nature's House. We are beyond excited and happy about the results of the work. So I'm going to take a few minutes now to look at if anyone has any questions, we're going to look at the Q&A. So I'm going to read them aloud, and then Rosemary will be able to answer them for you. So the first one is from Alex. Hi, Alex. Hi, Rosemary. Thank you all for this information. What do you recommend is the most ecological / ethical way to source topsoil down here on the South Shore and or in general?
Yeah, soil is a tough one, right? They're not making more of it, that's for sure. So, you know, we have to remember that we're on this planet, we're on this bubble, and there's not a whole lot coming back in to create things like soil and oxygen for us. So we really want to think about where our products are coming from. If you can go and see the site where they're mining the soil from. Mining sounds like a big scary word, a more industrial word, but technically that's what we're doing. We're taking material from one zone and turning it into something else and putting it somewhere else. So, you know, that is sort of mining in its truest sense. I tend to talk to my old farmer friends, places that are maybe going through some development, and seeing if we can rescue that topsoil from those spaces, and then store it so that we can mix it with manures and whatnot. But I would say your biggest thing is getting to the source and having a look around, taking a soil sample for yourself, walking the land, talking to the cattle, the cows, the horses that might be living there, talking to the farmers, finding out if they're using, you know, high levels of chemicals on the fields that the soil is coming from, or if their animals are, you know, taking in antibiotics and all kinds of other implements that the farming industry has. So you want to kind of see your materials from both ends of the story. What's the beginning of it? Where is it coming from? But how is it manufactured? What are you doing with it? Grinding it up, adding materials to it, sifting it, and then how is it actually getting to your landscape too, right? So yeah, the more you know, the better, for sure.
Great. On a similar vein, where do you source native plants from the wild, or where do you find them?
Sure, native species, you know, are just coming on as sort of a big trend, but also in the greenhouse industry, the horticulture industry, more and more people are getting, you know, interested in having plants that are less needy. And certainly native species are like that. You know, they come from this place, they live here, they know the soil structure, they know the critters, and so they can, you know, live with us really easily and quite well. I look to, rather than digging out of nature per se, I look to our nurseries to help us find those plants. Hopefully they are doing, you know, ethical sourcing of seed or cuttings. At our nursery at Helping Nature Heal, we have a large acreage that we are collecting seed from, taking cuttings, either stem cuttings, but also root cuttings. And then whenever we have to, whenever we have to develop a space, you know, if we are putting in a road or we are helping a homeowner to grub a site for their new development, then we'll rescue those plants and we'll save them at our nursery and grow them out until they're, you know, potentially saleable. There are great nurseries, though. I would shout out to Baldwin's Nursery in Falmouth, Briar Patch in Berwick. There's a whole host of nurseries. If you connect with us, we can give you our list of those, many of which are taking on native species, as a core product in their repertoire now. So digging from nature is a whole other webisode or webinar, I think, but I'll just be very sort of factual at this stage. Firstly, if it's on your own land, if you own the property, then you have a little more leeway. Then I would never recommend going into a park or into any actual wild spaces and digging plants out of there. The ecosystem is such a tightly knit puzzle that if you take something out, you are likely harming a whole host of other things. So I would not recommend digging fresh dig out of nature itself. If you own the land, or if you know, you have permission from the landowner to go in, we abide what we call the conservationist ethic. And that's where if you identify a clutch of plants, say you are in your backyard and you see that there are 100 baby hemlocks growing in a specific space in your backyard. Now, clearly 100 hemlocks are probably not going to survive living so tightly in a little seed clutch like that. So I would take, within the conservationist ethic, it's about taking only 10% of any one what's the word I'm looking for? Any one clutch of plants, any zone that has a collection of the same species in it, 10% only of that clutch. So out of that 100 hemlocks, I would take 10 and pot those up and grow them out, you know, in a raised bed or in a nursery bed somewhere. And then I would repair the soil that I took them from with potentially some manure, some leaves, maybe some coarse woody debris, and repair that wound that I've just created. And then potentially next year, I would take another 10% until I had just the right amount that actually could sustain their lives and really come to fruition in a tight zone like my own backyard. So there's some rules and regulations that I would encourage you to abide by, and we can certainly send those out to anyone who's interested. If they shoot us an email, I can give you the full gamut of those recommendations about digging from nature. But A, don't do it in a park or in a space that you don't own. B, get permission from whoever does own it, or ask yourself if you really need to do that. And then C, be very cautious while doing it, taking only 10% and protecting the land around the plant that you want to dig out, so that you're not you know, breaking a different plant that you potentially aren't interested in today, but in the future you could be. So we don't want to harm the nature, and we want to keep the habitat as full and robust as possible. So be very cautious on that, and do connect with us about more of the details on doing that.
So informative. Thank you so much. We're going to try to do a few more. We've got, I think, 11 questions. So we're going to try to get through as many as we can, and we are going to go over a little bit, so I apologize. But the next one is really great, and I actually want to know this because I have the same issue. Any suggestions for native plants that could compete with invasive species such as goutweed or bishopsweed? I have goutweed in my yard, so I'm looking forward to your answer, Rosemary.
Yeah, goutweed is a tough one, and of course it's an invasive species, but you know, you can eat it. So so I would check in with your local herbalist or your local native plant professional and find out about that. But it is the greenery makes a great salad, and the root systems are an awesome substitute for pasta. It looks just like spaghetti, and you can cook it up just the same. And I've done that many times, and so I would encourage that. But of course, big warning, don't eat anything that you haven't researched or investigated for yourself. And even though it says it's edible, take your time in getting to know these plants so that you don't harm your stomach. So the big thing about invasive species eradication is manual labor is always best. Not using chemicals or machinery as much as possible is always my first option. A little sweat equity and a bit of labor can actually, depending on your infestation, can do a lot of good. And it really helps you to get to know the plant well and to know the plants that it's running through. Goutweed especially, because of that long spaghetti-like root system, will wind its way around your good plants or the plants that you love in the landscape. So as you're digging out those roots, you get to actually really investigate how the other plants are growing and how their roots are working, and whether it's a lateral runner root or a tap root. And knowing about the roots is really important, and about their connection to each other. So I wouldn't say that there is a native species that will outcompete goutweed, but there's definitely other plants that do great. So I would think of things like irises, especially in a wet zone. The marsh marigolds have pretty tenacious root systems and are great for holding in slopes against erosion. And their roots are somewhat similar in tenacity. So, you know, if you clean your goutweed out and then add these natives in, you might be able to kind of combat that how invasive they are. So another couple native plants that are great ground covers are things like bunchberry, partridgeberry, ferns, and they also take up a lot of density in the soil horizon. If you think about root systems, ferns really push out everybody else. They've got that big spongy taproot that's deep and wide, and so it can help to push out the other plants that you don't necessarily want there. So that might be a good one to think about. Again, with these questions, they're sort of multi-layered and multifaceted. So if we don't get to them all, I would certainly, email back or encourage people to call me or send us by email, and then I can go into more detail with more resources as well.
Excellent. So we'll try to get through a few more. So from Patrick, hey Rosemary, thank you for sharing all of your fantastic wisdom. I found the bit on incorporating coarse woody debris, rocks, and native species to be remarkably interesting. As an amateur gardener, would you recommend utilizing some of these features in a vegetable garden, vegetables such as tomatoes or cucumbers?
Sure. A vegetable garden, has a really active soil food web as well as the native garden. And even though those plants are annuals, they certainly still need all those interactions in underground to make them really healthy and strong. Coarse woody debris can look just like mulch too, right? So we often mulch the raised beds that we make for people, but even if you have a garden that's tilled in the soil and that you do more of a traditional agriculture where you plant in rows, having wood fiber in between the rows is really beneficial for a couple reasons. One, it helps to feed the soil food web critters that are existing there, and that will help those tomatoes and basils to really perform and do their work. And also they can float you if you do like a wood chip path between your rows in your various crops. Then you are kind of floating above the soil horizon on this really airy wood chip layer, so that you're not compacting the soil within your garden beds. And then as that wood fiber is decomposing, of course, it's taking a bit of nitrogen out of the soil horizon. So always adding amendments to your beds like manures and seaweeds is really helpful to kind of balance that engagement at the nutrient level, so that you have appropriate nutrients cycling through your system. Coarse woody debris could also look like a bench, a log bench, or a rain barrel, or a piece of art, or a structure of some kind. Maybe it's just a stump that you rest your tools on, or that you sit on while you're gardening. So it doesn't have to be logs and things like that. You can figure it out in more creative ways if you want. We're always collecting driftwood or interesting pieces of bark, and that can be your coarse woody debris as well. So have fun with it and try to see how many different ways you can incorporate wood into your soil horizon. That'll be a great, and I would look for tips on that. So as you work to figure out different ways of incorporating these details into your landscape, send me an email with photos and stuff, and that'd be really exciting to see how other people are figuring it out. Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. This next question is probably quite applicable to your specialty of working on the coastline. So this is from Lois. She asks, I'm located on an exposed piece of property right on the coast. Lots of wind and salt spray. Any suggestions as to which type of plants we could use? We're hoping to replace our lawn with indigenous plants that can thrive in this environment. Great question.
Oh, this is so great. I'm so glad that you're replacing that lawn, especially on the coastline, because the compaction of that lawn, you know, we think about the lawn mower, whether it's a push lawn mower or a ride-on, you know, driving up and down on that lawn right near the coast. It's just really compacting that, especially if we own that property for a length of time. You think you mow every week for 30 years or something. That compaction really makes a difference at the end. So I would say, getting off the lawn is great, and switching that over to more of a meadow with small shrubs, maybe even some small trees, will be wonderful. We do this a lot for people, and especially in our living shoreline work, almost always we transition the upland, the portion above the high water mark. We often transition that into meadows and into buffer zones that contain all of the ecosystem triangle components. So most folks are concerned with the view from the house across that lawn and out to sea, and that's why there's a lawn there for most part, so that you have this clear, this clear view out to the water. And that's great. You can achieve that same goal of having that beautiful view with a meadow, and even with small shrubs and trees displayed within it. So if you think of how a meadow works, it's regenerating all the time, and a lawn is being cut, right? They're kind of the opposites. The lawn is being kept at a immature state constantly, and so it never really gets to come to fruition. It never really gets to flower and attract all the critters to it. So if you simply stop mowing, you'll notice that the grasses actually get to mature. The birds come in, they want to eat that seed, right? Then there's all the other bugs and things that go along with that. And before you know it, you'll notice that there's a lot of nature already present. Most of the seed is already locked in the soil horizon below the lawn mowing. And so when you stop, the ground starts to soften up, it absorbs the rain a bit more, it gets a little more spongy, and therefore the seeds that are locked in the soil horizon below us, those ancient seeds actually get to germinate and show up and then come to fruition if you're not mowing it. So you'll find daisies, strawberries, hawkweed, viola, maybe even trailing raspberry. And those grasses that are naturally occurring, the caryxes, the fescues, all of those grasses will show up if you just stop mowing. Then I tend to take a moment and just look at it and observe and see what's going on there, because there will be gaps. There will be things that you don't necessarily like, or things that maybe you're allergic to, like asters. And so you can have that opportunity then to just rest and observe, and then decide, okay, what don't I like? Is there too much of one thing in one zone, not enough in another? Is there something that's causing me allergy problems? We'll dig that out and switch it out. This is where the heritage perennials come in really well. Things like echinacea, like daylilies, like bee balm. Although we have a native bee balm, there's so many different varieties these days. Having some different colors might be nice. different black-eyed Susans, Gaillardias, different types of goldenrods even, different colors, heights, and sizes of asters. You know, it's really an opportunity to convert this green carpet into something that has such abundance and creativity and inspiration kind of already built into it. So I'm really glad that you're looking to convert your lawn, and I would certainly you know, help you with that if you like, with some plant lists and whatnot, and some strategies. There's different types of conversion that you can do. We saw the sod conversion at Nature's House with the cardboard. But there's also berms and grogles and different methods to make this happen and make it really a success. So certainly, you know, shoot me an email if you haven't gotten enough information already, and we're happy to provide that for you.
That I'm inspired personally. It sounds amazing. It sounds like you've also answered one of the other participants had a question very similar to that one. I'm hoping you answered it. She also has a significant amount of grassland on an oceanfront property, and she wanted to know the best way to convert to a natural meadow without introducing a lot of trees or shrubs that will block her view, and recommending particular plants that will penetrate and establish themselves in the grass. So it sounds like you've hopefully answered that question with your previous answer. So if
Great. Yeah, if I could just interject one more thing, keeping a meadow as a meadow takes a little bit of maintenance because, of course, there's our natural successional patterns that are trying to get to work, right? We're in the Acadian forest system, and our land is trying to get back to being a forest again. So if you don't want the shrubs and the trees to naturally, you know, come up, or you don't want to add those to your palette, then you do need to mow at least once a year to ensure that the sort of the woodies, we call them, the rose bushes, the raspberries, the bayberries, that they don't take hold of your landscape. So we need to, if we're keeping it as a meadow, then there's a little bit of work to be done there. But if you want it to go through its natural progression through the successional patterns, then you can actually just step back and let it happen. We always sort of design pathways and things through them so that you can access in there and not trample on the plants. So there's a few design details that I could certainly help others out if they have more questions there. Because some people think that it is just a stop mowing and walk away. That is definitely a type of meadow, but it is going to mature and go through some patterns where you'll end up with shrubs and trees. So just a word of caution that if you want to keep it as a meadow, there's a little extra effort that has to go into it.
Excellent. Oh, thank you so much for adding that. That's really helpful. I think I'm going to ask one more question. We do have a few that we probably won't get to. I would ask anyone that we don't, and anyone who has any additional questions or that we don't get to, please reach out to either myself or Rosemary, and we will do our best to find some answers for you. So one of the questions I was asked by a number of people was they're looking for resources for information on Nova Scotia native plants. Are there books, websites, or other types of resources that you can recommend that people can access?
Sure, there's lots of wonderful books out there, of course. Many wonderful authors who have penned and put together some really great resources for us. One that comes to the top of my head, of course, is the Jamie Simpson book, Restoring the Acadian Forest. It has a plant list within that and gives you some companion planting details and how to really cultivate that coarse woody debris and what do you do with it once you get it, building brush walls and things like that. So Jamie's book is really great. I use it all the time. There's also a book called Ecological Gardening. It's just a nice little handbook. It's a small little text. We have some resources here in our library. I'm just trying to think of them all. I would have brought a stack of them with me today. Let's see. So I would say Google can be your best friend now that we're all digital and everyone is looking towards that. Just punching in native plants, you know, natural gardening, ecological gardening. Those will, you know, drive up some books for you. The local library system here in Bridgewater has got a whole shelving unit full of natural gardening books. I don't want to leave anybody out. I know that Jody DeLong has a really beautiful book on perennials and shrubs that work really well here in coastal communities. Yeah, so I'm sort of remiss to give you a big list right off the top of my head, but I certainly can put together that book list and email it to anyone who has that question for sure. And then, of course, lots of websites. Nature Trust has a great website, of course, you guys do. The EAC also has some good resources online too. And yeah, and I can get a book list to anyone who prefers hardcover over digital for sure.
That sounds it sounds like something that would be a lot of fun to do this summer, is to sit and admire your growing meadow and read one of those books. It's a great time of year to enjoy an actual book instead of digital. So hopefully you will all have some success in finding the resources that you need and want. And Rosemarie, thank you so much for offering to follow up with anyone who has any additional questions. As I said, please feel free to contact either one of us. We really want to thank you all so very much for joining us today and giving us your time and attention. And we're excited to be able to bring this to you, and I feel like I learned a lot today, so I'm really happy and excited about that. And I wanted to let you know that we will be, this session has been recorded, so we will be making that recording available in the coming days. We might want to edit it a little bit, but and thank you. And I am just seeing some of the chats right now. Great presentation. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for the kind words and for your participation. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy the sunshine and your gardens. And we look forward to hearing more from you at some point.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Stay in touch. Bye now.
Bye.